So I'm in the final kind of stage of this, just putting a second final coat of varnish on. Now I used to make, well actually I still do make, what I used to call button gardens. I'll put a picture up. Which is essentially a load of buttons to represent kind of a pond and some rocks and a couple of stick-on dragonflies. Now they look alright, they do what it says on the tin, as it were, but I wanted to try something a little bit more interesting. So I've been wandering around YouTube as usual, and some time ago I found and was quite fascinated by a Japanese craft of layering resin and paint to create kind of 3D goldfish. So that's kind of where this idea came from. First of all, I need to make the kind of border for the pond. So I'm using some lolly sticks, popsicle sticks, because they're pretty much pre-finished, so I don't need to do anything particular with them. So I'm just cutting them to size. So I'm cutting pretty loosely. I'm not being too concerned about exact sizes. Just using a template just to get kind of the rough size of top and bottom edge. Now the bottom obviously fits exactly to the box, and the top I've got at least kind of 15mm above, so I've got room for my pond. It's a fairly tedious job, and I'm doing so many. I'm doing 4 because one, I don't know how well they're going to work and I might have a couple of fails and have to retire some, and 2, with the resin layering I can't mix very, very small batches of resin. The resin I've got, you can't do less than 2 fluid ounces. So in order to get a thin enough layer of resin, you need to kind of have a lot of things to do with it. So rather than having different projects on the go, I'll do a batch of these instead. So I might need to change resins for any future projects. So I'm just sticking these on. I'm just using standard Gorilla Glue because it's going on top of a painted surface. If I'd thought about it, I would have sanded that back and gone with a kind of nearly bare wood, but I don't think it really matters because the resin coat on top at least holds everything together, so it's not vital. So once I've gone all the way round with my popsicle sticks, I then start the painting stage. Now, this is a little bit fiddly, a little bit finicky really. So first I want to do the base of the pond, and I could have just left it as is and just poured paint in and poured sand in and glued that in instead, but what I'm doing is using a really, really thick layer of acrylic, and instead of making it smooth, I'm deliberately swirling the paint so you've got different layers and different thicknesses, and that shows as kind of different colours through the thickness of paint. Then I'm dumping on a whole load of sand and allowing that to dry on top, so that gives it kind of a texture and depth on the inside, even through the resin. And then outside of the sticks I'm just doing a very light kind of wash of acrylic, almost like wood stain. I'm not really concerned about the finish of that because the variation in the wood of the sticks is going to cause general variations anyway, so doing it that way just gives it a more realistically garden pondish look, I suppose. So, and then we're on to the finishing, which seems a bit strange, but I had a thought that kind of the resin is the last thing to be done, essentially. That I might as well get all the bits on the inside done in between layers, or all at once. which for some of these was a good idea, others it really wasn't, because I had leakage through the wood, and that caused some issues with the lining and the inside painting. But I think I should have masked off with some plastic or something, which I ended up doing on the second and subsequent layers of resin. But I do have to then prise these apart when it comes to sorting things out. So, but I made a point of each new layer I checked to see that everything was still moving and still opening, so I didn't have a massive amount of stuff to kind of cut through and cut off essentially. So I'm just using basic lining, which is just some felt. I'm sorting out hinges and all that kind of stuff. And now we're on to the resin bit. Now this was actually quite easy, although it was fairly frustrating, because you can only do a small amount at a time, and then you have to wait for a period for things to set enough to move on to the next bit. So if you want a fast craft, this isn't it. So first I started off with some gravel. This is just kind of pea gravel. Gave it all a wash because it was quite sandy and dirty, so washed it and then laid it out to dry, and then I picked over the gravel to pick out some nice, slightly more rounded, larger rocks, so that I've got the kind of rougher ones on the underneath layers and then the rounded ones on top. So I'm building up the shape with the rougher ones and actually having the more kind of actual rounded river or pond rocks on the surface. Oop. So started with the smallest amount of varnish I could make, which wasn't very small really, and then dumped in a whole load of pebbles, and I shaped that around the edges of my ponds, trying to create a bit more of a barrier for the next layers of resin, whilst kind of building up the shape of kind of the landscape essentially of the pond. And the stones that I picked out, I'm placing them on top so they're stuck into the resin but they're not covered, so it kind of looks like kind of a half dry rock rather than having all the rocks shiny and wet looking. It's just kind of slightly artistic touch, I think. And then we're on to the painting and layering. I'll include a full diagram of the different layers that the professionals do, because they tend to do 6 or 7 layers of paint with the resin, and I just couldn't do more than 4 really. I'd had enough by that point, so I did double up quite a bit, although I don't think putting real depth of resin on these would have helped any. As it is, they're about as high as they can hold really, and any more than that I'd need to build a extra large wall. So, and I think I used too much white in the painting. I'm using acrylic. I think what you really need to do is avoid white wherever possible, because white makes everything opaque, and you want that kind of transparent effect kind of being the whole point of making something like this. So I ended up with 3 layers, and I'll draw a little diagram and stick that on there for you, which would have worked if my layers of resin were really thin, because you only need maybe 1 or 2 millimeters thickness or depth of resin. I think some of these were a little bit too thick. I got a bit carried away. But as it was, it took a number of days, because I'm painting after about 8 hours, so the resin is nowhere near set, but it's still slightly tacky, which is about where it needs to be. But being slightly tacky, you can't then wash out anything you've done wrong. And I've got one of my fish is slightly mutant looking, because you can't really erase it once you've made a mistake, so I had to go with that. So yeah, layers and layers of resin, and then I'm done really. I'm fairly happy with these. They've come out really quite well. I'm not so sure how well the video is going to come out, because the resin has got a lot of reflective surface, so it shines and all the light goes wrong. My hexagonal one, I've got an idea. I want to turn it into something similar to one of my old ponds, my old button ponds. Oh, I've got one here. So that's what I used to do, and still do, using large, very flat buttons to create kind of a pond, and then smaller earthy tones to make stones, and these stick on dragonflies, which are all well and good, but there's no real realism in them. There's no kind of creativity in sticking one of those on. So I had the intention of making one out of wire and hot glue. Now I'm not entirely sure about this fella. It looks rather chunky. It needs another couple of coats of paint really to get the effect. I'm not sure if I'm going to use him or something else, but I don't have any thinner wire than this. So, oops, it's raining. I've got to get the washing in. See you next week.